أعجوبة طبيعية في مكان ساحر ارتبطت فيه الأساطير عبر الزمن. أكثر من 40,000 عمود بازلتي على شكل سداسي تنحدر من التل على ساحل كوزوي في إيرلندا الشمالية لتختفي في البحر. من السهل الخلط بين هذه الأعمدة من مسافة بعيدة في البحر بمداخن قلعة عملاقة. هذا ما تخيلته إحدى سفن أرمادا التي لا تقهر، والتي فقدت في هذه المياه بعد هزيمتها عندما قصف الأسبان الساحل المهجور لفترة طويلة، معتقدين أنهم كانوا يحاصرون القلعة. البعض ظن أن هذه الظاهرة الطبيعية كانت قلاع كبيرة، والآخر ربطها في عالم الأساطير والعمالقة، حتى إنها باتت تسمى بممر العمالقة حتى يومنا هذا. فما هي هذه الأسطورة التي سمي المكان تيمنا بها؟ وما هو السبب العلمي وراء هذه الظاهرة الطبيعية الفريدة؟
The Giant's Causeway is one of the top fascinating geological features in the world. Its hexagonal, evenly spaced columns protrude up from the sea and have fascinated locals and tourists for many years.
The scenery and the landscape around the causeway is absolutely stunning and breathtaking. It's been so magnificent growing up here. It's been such a privilege to be part of such an amazing, varied landscape of beauty.
There are loads of stories attached to loads of natural features of the landscape. In fact, whether it's in Britain, whether it's in Ireland, whether it's in Jordan, anything that's a bit unusual will gather a story.
مناظر خلابة تأسر المخيلة على طول هذا الساحل، والذي يأخذك إلى عالم الأساطير والخيال. يقع ممر العمالقة على ساحل كوزوي في إيرلندا الشمالية على بعد 100 كيلومتر شمال العاصمة بلفاست. تحيط هذه الأعمدة بالمنحدرات الواقعة على الساحل، ثم تتجه تدريجيا تحت الماء نحو اسكتلندا. إذا نظرت إلى طريق العمالقة من الأعلى، فإنها تشبه إلى حد بعيد طريق مرصوفة بالحجارة تمتد على طول الساحل لمسافة 275 مترا قبل أن تختفي في مياه المحيط الأطلسي. حوالي 40,000 عمود حجري ضخم يصل ارتفاع بعضها إلى 12 مترا، يتجاورون مع بعضهم البعض بشكل وثيق، بحيث يبدو أن عمالقة الأساطير الإيرلندية قد قاموا بتركيبها هناك.
It is quite a striking natural formation, there's no question. It's a lovely walk down to it, and it's an interesting place, even when it's covered in tourists. It's a very photogenic place. And just a wee bit further on down the coast, about a mile, half a mile or so, there's the giant Sorghum pipes. The same rock formation going up the cliff, only they're supposed to be organ pipes for the giant, you know? And there is no doubt, however, that since then, the story has become very firmly attached to that part of the coast.
Columns like this can be seen in many other places around the world. There are similar columns in Cape Howie in Tasmania. Also, Iceland hosts some of the spectacular basalt columns, though probably none as famous as Giant's Causeway.
تعتبر المنطقة المحيطة بطريق العمالقة محمية وطنية، والطريق نفسه مدرج كموقع للتراث الثقافي العالمي.
There are loads of stories attached to loads of natural features of the landscape. In fact, whether it's in Britain, whether it's in Ireland, whether it's in Jordan, anything that's a bit unusual will gather a story, you know? a story will form, you know. And we experience our landscape in part through stories, like Sherwood Forest. Because Sherwood Forest today is not particularly startling. It only becomes interesting because of the stories. So I think the role of story making and storytelling in our experience of and our understanding of the landscape has not gone away at all.
بما أن الأساطير تجذب أصحاب الخيال الواسع، دعونا نتعمق فيها قبل الغوص في التحليل العلمي. تقول الأسطورة إن المحارب الإيرلندي فين ماكول بنى ممراً يمتد إلى اسكتلندا، وتروي أن العملاق الاسكتلندي بنندونر كان قد أعلن تحديه لفين، وكان الأول أضخم كثيراً من الثاني، ما دفع فين إلى التفكير في مخرج من هذه المواجهة، وجاء خلاصه على يد زوجته التي اقترحت فكرة: تنكره بزي طفل وتغطيته في مهد. وعندما عبر بنندونر الجسر بحثاً عنه، أخبرته أوناج أن فين ذهب للتحطيب وسيعود قريباً، بعد أن جعلته يعتقد أن من في المهد هو ابن فين، حيث رأى حجم الطفل. فر مرتعباً من المنزل وحطم الممر أو الجسر خلفه حتى لا يلحق به فين ماكول العملاق.
The legend of the Giant's Causeway. There was a giant called Finn McCool, and across the water in Scotland there was another giant called Benandonna, and Finn, the Irish giant, decided that the world was too big for two giants, so he built a bridge.
And one day, the rabbit Finn grabbed rocks from the Giant's Causeway and he threw them into the water to create a path of stepping stones that led from one side all the way to the other.
Across the sea, and decided he would go over and sort this fella Benandonna out. And when he got there, he discovered that actually this was a really big giant.
Finn decided that he wasn't quite up to standard, he wasn't quite up to size to take on his opponent. So, not to be defeated, he decided for his wife to disguise him as a baby.
There's various different versions of the story. In one version of the story, Finn actually fights the giant and defeats him. But in the most common version of the story, Finn decides that this guy's just too big for him. So he got his wife to dress him up like a baby and put him in the baby's cot, obviously a giant's baby.
When Benandonna crossed this causeway and came across the giant baby,
she said, "Oh, Finn's out, he's not here. But, excuse me, I have to go inside. Come inside, I'll get you something to eat." And she showed him the baby in the cot. Benandonna took one look at this huge baby and thought, "Oh dear, his dad must be a really big man."
he was absolutely petrified. So he ran all the way back to Scotland, as fast as his legs could carry him.
Finn destroys the bridge that he built behind him so that he can't come back over.
Another version involves affairs of the heart. The same Finn fell in love head over heels with a maiden on the other side of the sea. So he built his causeway in a desperate attempt to lure her back to Ireland.
تم الإعلان عن اكتشاف الجسر العملاق في العالم بأسره عام 1693 بعد أن اكتشفه الأسقف ديري في العام السابق، وحظي الموقع باهتمام دولي حين رسمت فنانة دوبلن سوزانا دوروري لوحات مائية عنه عام 1743. وفي عام 1765 ظهرت مقدمة حول المكان في المجلد 12 من الموسوعة الفرنسية.
And so the actual name that the Giant's Causeway only really stems from the late 1690s into the 1700s. Now, the Irish name for the causeway today in Irish is actually the bridge or the stepping stones of the Fomorians. And the Fomorians were supposedly the first Irish people, the people who first colonized Ireland. But they're mythological people, they're not real. And I suspect that the name, the causeway or the stepping stones of the Fomorians in Irish is also fairly recent. However that may be, the story of Finn the giant has passed into the local folklore. And certainly when I grew up, I've been thinking about this in the knowledge that I would be talking about it, and I have no idea when I first heard the story at all. But it is the common story about this natural rock formation.
The way I perceive the Giant's Causeway is quite different, I think, to most people. And that's because it's been the backdrop to my childhood and also to my life as a whole, really. I remember my grandmother telling us the legend ever since I was small. She'd tell us lots of stories about Irish folklore. And if I'm being completely honest, to me as a child, the whole legend seemed to be real. I did truly believe it. But when I got older and I realised eventually that the Giant's Causeway wasn't real, well, it was real in a sense, it's a real place, but the legend surrounding it with giants and legends, that wasn't quite so real. But it's kind of like when you get told that Santa Claus isn't real. It was like that kind of moment for me in my childhood. But I think there'll always be a small part of me that really wishes that it was true.
It's just a good story, you know? And there are other good stories about the giant Finn McCool. He's supposed to have created the Isle of Man by grabbing a huge, big lump of the earth and throwing it at another giant across the water. But his reach wasn't long enough, and the earth that he threw splashed down in the middle of the Irish Sea and became the Isle of Man. And the hole that he dug out with his hand became Lough Neagh, which is the largest inland waterway in Ireland. So these are the stories about the Giant's Causeway and about the giant Finn McCool. But it's quite important to recognise that this giant Finn McCool doesn't really have much relationship to the heroic Finn McCool of the older stories.
إيرلندا بلد عريق ومكان مليء بالأساطير. تشتهر إيرلندا بقصصها الشفوية، ولديها العديد من القصص التي تم تناقلها عبر كل جيل مع نسخ مختلفة لكل منها. حفظ التراث الشفهي المحافظ أساطير إيرلندا قبل المسيحية، ومع وصول المسيحية كتبت أول المخطوطات في إيرلندا لتحفظ كثيرا من هذه الحكايات في الأدب الإيرلندي. ومع أن التأثير المسيحي ملحوظ في هذه المخطوطات، فإنها تقدم أوسع الفروع وأفضلها حفظا من الميثولوجيا الكلتية.
But what's perhaps most interesting about the story is that there are a whole lot of stories about Finn McCool. They form what's called the Athenian Cycle or the Athena Cycle or the Finn Cycle, depending on who's calling them, who's describing them. And these are stories about an Irish hero that were written down between the 7th and the 14th centuries over a period of 700 years. But they're not about a giant. The giant, the Finn McCool of the actual stories, the original stories, wasn't a giant at all. He was a hero. He was a warrior. And the stories are all about him, and the notion of a giant is nowhere mentioned, and the giant's causeway is nowhere mentioned in these stories. And the other interesting thing about these stories is that the historical Finn McCool, if indeed he was a real person, was based way to the south of Ireland. He was nowhere, he wasn't based in the north at all. So how the story of the Giant's Causeway came about is an interesting question.
منذ حوالي 50 إلى 60 مليون عام تعرضت منطقة أنتريم لنشاط بركاني مكثف، ونظراً لأن الحمم تعرضت إلى البرودة بشكل سريع تسببت بانكماش حراري نتج عنه تشققات أسفرت عن تكون بنية تشبه الأعمدة التي تشققت بدورها في اتجاه أفقي مخلفة رقائق منها، تتكون أساساً من البازلت الغني بالمغنيسيوم والحديد، والتي تحتوي في نفس الوقت على كمية صغيرة من الكوارتز. بفضل هذا التكوين تمكنت الأعمدة من تحمل الآثار المدمرة للرياح والأمواج العاتية للمحيط الأطلسي بنجاح.
The pillars formed approximately 60 million years ago. The region consisted of chalk sedimentary beds that were subjected to volcanic activity, forming a lake of lava that cooled relatively quickly, creating the shapes that we see now. There are over 40,000 basalt hexagonal columns, pretty much all uniform in shape. What caused this is actually not that unique to this windy coast of Northern Ireland. The rapidly cooling lava cools from the outside towards the centre, which causes contractions. The differences in the way it cools leads to the formation of the hexagonal column shapes. New studies have deciphered more of the science on how these columns formed. It is estimated that the temperature of the jointing or cracking happens at around 850 degrees Celsius, based on the studies of basalt from volcanoes in Iceland. Computer models have worked out why columns take the hexagonal form. The lava cools and cracks at right angles around 90 degrees initially. Then, as it cools, it rearranges to change to 120 degrees, thus forming the angles of the hexagons.
And the landscape around the causeway is absolutely stunning and breathtaking. But it's not the only thing on offer. If you go and take a 10-minute drive west of the causeway, you'll come to an amazing castle called Dunluce, which is full of history. In fact, it's even built with the same rocks that form the causeway. It was even used in filming in the popular TV series Game of Thrones.
تقع قلعة دونلوس على المنحدرات الصخرية غرب ممر العمالقة. تم بناء القلعة ما بين القرنين ال15 وال16 الميلادي، وكانت إحدى أرقى القلاع على الساحل الإيرلندي. تم بناء القلعة في الأصل على يد عائلة ماكويلين الذين أتوا من اسكتلندا في القرن الثالث عشر كمرتزقة مستأجرين، وقاموا ببناء القلعة بعد حوالي 200 عام. احتفظت عائلة ماكويلين بالقلعة لمدة 55 عاما تقريبا، قبل أن ينتزعها آل ماكدونالدز الذين جاءوا من اسكتلندا عام 1554. للقلعة أيضا روابط إلى جيرونا، سفينة الأرمادة الإسبانية التي تحطمت أمام ممر العمالقة عندما ظنوا مخطئين أن هذه الأعمدة الصخرية كانت قلعة العدو. استعاد آل ماكدونيل المدافع من حطام السفينة ونصبوها كتذكار في القلعة، وقاموا بدفن الجثث في الباحة المجاورة. كانت القلعة أيضا مملوكة من قبل رئيس وزراء بريطانيا السابق وينستون تشرشل، الذي انتقلت القلعة إلى ملكية عائلته نتيجة الزواج.
And if you drive even further west, you'll come across some beautiful white sandy beaches, which wouldn't be out of place in the Caribbean, if I'm honest. And some people are really shocked when they find that Ireland actually has all these amazing, stunning places to offer.
يعتبر ممر العمالقة مركزاً سياحياً هاماً، يجذب السائحين من جميع أنحاء البلاد وخارجها، حيث يتوافد الناس إليه حتى يعيشوا عالم الخيال من خلال هذه الظاهرة الطبيعية. المدينة الأقرب لممر العمالقة هي بورتراش، والتي تتمتع بشواطئ بيضاء شبيهة بتلك في جزر المالديف.
Well, there have always been tourists here, for as long as I can remember, to be honest. And honestly, it's not really that surprising, seeing as the Causeway is actually one of the most popular attractions in Northern Ireland.
But these days, what's way more important as a story to Irish tourism is Game of Thrones.
We have had a massive uptick in tourism over the last couple of years, and in part that must be due to Game of Thrones being filmed here. And it's not that surprising they chose this location, to be honest with you. I mean, it's so rich and varied in history, and the landscape's absolutely stunning. It's the perfect place to depict Game of Thrones, a realm of fantasy and myth and legend.
Quite a few of the locations for Game of Thrones were around. There was one day, for example, we were at home on holiday, and twice in one day we came across filming of Game without even looking for it. There has been in the past a huge amount of Game of Thrones tourism. Cruise ships, for example, would dock in Belfast, and the coaches would be waiting to take people on a day trip around the Game of Thrones locations. And in fact, even cruise ships that docked in Dublin, which is a good way away, the coaches would be waiting for them, and they'd drive north and they'd do all of this. And it was an absolute economic godsend. It was brilliant for it's died away a bit, and it's largely died away because of COVID, actually. That 2 years of no tourism, effectively, it has yet to recover. But that's the stories of Game of Thrones and the locations. Oh, the stories will last because they end up being made into films. For example, Robin Hood's a better example. How many films are there about Robin Hood? They're all nonsense, but the story persists. And King Arthur's the same. And if you look at the fairy stories like Hansel and Gretel, The Babes in the Wood, Cinderella, Little Red Riding Hood, it's no coincidence that Disney made his name with things like Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, for example, and the Evil Queen. It's no coincidence. These stories will last because they provide content makers, if you like, to use the modern term, with material. People thought that when books came along, when writing came along, some people thought that it would do away with storytelling. No, it didn't. It just was another medium within which these stories could be told. And in fact, it provided also means of preserving them. I mean, technology doesn't do away with them, it preserves them. And the same is true for film, for example. And okay, yeah, the stories change as a result, but they change anyway. That's the other thing about stories, they don't stand still.
يصعب تصديق أن هذه الأعمدة قد تشكلت طبيعياً على ساحل كوزوي الخلاب. لذلك ستظل الأساطير والتاريخ المحيط بها الدور الأبرز لجذب المهتمين لرؤية هذه الظاهرة الفريدة.